we are attempting to tackle two very big words, ethnicity and gender. It's not too long ago that some notable scholars looked at the field of immigration literature, immigration scholarship, and decided that maybe a classic narrative of these cisgendered male migrants was a little bit lacking. So writers like Mary Di Michele, Luis de Salvo, and scholars like Donna Gabacha, Franca Iacovetta, they began to write the experiences of female migrants, which was very novel at the time. And they gave kind of a voice to the important role that women played in this experience. And that was a step forward, of course, but it, for the most part, continued to subscribe to a very heteronormative view of Italianità. So there hasn't been that much exception, and we've kind of largely ignored the experiences of members who haven't fit into that traditional gendered narrative. I think more recently that's become problematized, and we're starting to reflect a little bit more critically on the way gender norms have affected the immigrant experience. And we're starting to tell new stories in a diverse field of disciplines. So artists, academic theorists working on this field have begun to problematize those ideas, the idea of sexuality, masculinity, femininity, what all of these terms even mean to us anymore. And so all four of our panelists here today have wrestled with these kinds of concepts, often for many decades in different ways. So we hope that this roundtable helps all of us kind of critically reflect on what kinds of questions we are asking about these things today and what kinds of questions we want to ask moving forward. As writers and scholars and artists and more. So like I said, it is a roundtable today. So each panelist is going to briefly outline their work first, but then we'll quickly move on to kind of a guided discussion where our panelists can kind of speak to the same issues. They can directly engage with each other, ask follow-up questions. So without further ado, Michela is going to start us off. Michela Baldo is a lecturer in translation studies at the University of Birmingham. One strand of her research revolves around the translation into Italian of Italian-Canadian works, with a specific focus on issues such as queerness and self-translation. She's also the author of Italian-Canadian Narratives of Return, Analyzing Cultural Translation in Diasporic Writing. And she's recently contributed to the book Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian-Canadian writing. And then another strand of her research concerns the role of translation in Italian queer feminist activism. And on that topic, she's published various articles and chapters and has co-edited with Jonathan Evans and Ting Guo a special issue of TIS on translation and LGBT queer activism. Michela, take it away.
Thank you, Abril, for the invitation, first of all, and also for the introduction. So I prepared a little bit of a presentation, PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to share on my kind of position and kind of my research on the topics that are discussed today, so ethnicity and gender. So I'm going to share it now. Okay, so I wanted just to say that my involvement with the notion of gender ethnicity dates back to my PhD studies on Italian-Canadian writing. And I became interested in specifically in the work of Italian-Canadian and Italian-American women's writing, and specifically queer writing. I discovered specifically the work of Anna Camilleri when I was in Vancouver in 2006, because I was asking a librarian for actually someone, a bookshop's assistant, for something to read interesting, and she suggested me to read Camilleri. So through the work of Camilleri, then I discovered other works, anthologies mainly of kind of writing that we can define like queer writing. So A Paisan, for example, an anthology by lesbian and men of gay men of Italian descent. And in this case, an anthology that works and is focused on Italian-American queer writing. Fuori, another anthology of essays by Italian-American queer writers, and other anthologies like Mamma Mia, etc. So through Anna Camilleri, then I discovered another anthology which became a kind of the topic of the my kind of introduction to the book you just mentioned, the edited book by Licia Canton, Here and Now. The anthology was called Coraggia. It was published in 1998 and edited by Domenica Di Leo, Sul, Angelina Ciato, and Gabriella Micallef, who were, so someone is not alive anymore, but self-identified lesbians. So the anthology really worked on the topics that I was also interested on the notion of ethnicity. And at the time, I was also becoming more and more interested in the notion of gender and sexuality. So the topic of Coraggia are, I would say, the coming out. Coming out in terms of kind of making visible the violence perpetrated by at home by members of the family towards the women who narrate their life experiences. And violence that was also linked to their coming out as lesbian and bisexual. So violence related also to non-heteronormative lives, in particular sexualities. So this topic, of course, was also kind of well developed by Anna Camilleri, that then became also the title and the a memoir that she published later on in 2004, and there's an article also included in this anthology. So I was interested mainly in looking at how the notion of ethnicity and gender couldn't coexist, gender and sexuality, mainly sexuality at some point, couldn't coexist for these writers. For example, Anne-Marie Fortier, on whom I also relied a lot in terms of reading in relation to queer diaspora, says that being lesbian, bisexual, queer cannot coexist with being Italian. And this is exactly the topic of many of the stories that feature in the anthology. So Ciato, and Angelina Ciato, for example, says, what I could never be in the feminist community was Sicilian, and what I could not be in my Sicilian community was lesbian. So these women basically cannot be what they are, depending on the context they are, they cross or they live. So it's impossible to kind of integrate ethnicity and sexuality. So some of these women, Capone, I mentioned the essay in one of her essays in Fuori, talks about the fact that I think she summarizes very well the condition of being split between allegiances. She says, how many times have I wondered to which family do I most belong? The lesbian gay community of San Francisco, in which I've lived as an out lesbian for many years, or my Italian-American family in New York, which is my ethnic base, the family into which I was born, but the family where I too often feel invisible and isolated as a lesbian. So the anthology basically wants to come to terms with this split, kind of to resolve the split, to try to integrate the kind of various belonging. And so Ciato, for example, reimagines the family table populated with Italian dykes that savor the coffee and kind of the sweets at the table. They kind of rediscover also that the ethnicity, it's important for they being as lesbian or bisexual in the community they kind of that surrounds them, they part of. So there is kind of coming to terms with the split in the way of retelling, reimagining also ethnicity, reimagining family. Camilleri says, I saw a future for myself in my stories. The stories is the place in which this reimagining, this retelling, this reintegration is possible. And also is the understanding that the Italian identity, the ethnicity, can be detached from gender and sexuality. So Laura Scacciabigel in the anthology Coraggio says, I think it's impossible to view this identity separately, because my Italian, my loving identity by being, me being a lover cannot be detached by me being Italian. I grew up and I was told how to love, etc. So these kind of topics are also discussed in some of my writing. I wrote about the translation of Kim Ragusa and other Italian-American writers into Italian. There was an interest a few years ago. And the scheme between us summarizes very well also this kind of in conflicts. We have here Kim Ragusa, who is Italian-American, and from her mother's side, you see a picture here of the two grandmothers. So the grandma side she's American, a Black American, and then there is the grandmama who is Italian-American. And these kind of families are in conflict, and the conflict really basically is summarized with a skin. A skin is either too white or too black, according to who views the skin. And at the end of the memoir, there is kind of a reconciliation of this. The grandmothers become kind of friends. They were always in conflict throughout their life. And she says, I kind of, I see myself as in the kind of gradation of light. We are all part of the same gradation of light. And so there is a reconciliation at the end about herself as a woman and herself as an ethnic being who's been constantly in conflict with herself. Some of the split of the kind of things I've already mentioned before about the impossibility of perceiving oneself as ethnic and sexualized at the same time. It's also found in the anthology Here and Now, edited by Licia Canton, which I just mentioned. And in this case, we have like a lot of writers that reassess the non-heteronormative genders and sexuality in relation to their Italianness, to come to terms with that. And for example, there is also there the realization that I remember, like, for example, one entry by Coccia in Let Them Mangia Cake, in which he remembers, he talks about his grandmom teaching him to cook, and also the fact that his love himself is very much linked to ethnicity, to his being Italian, and is preparing the Italian dinner to his lover, etc. So there's a lot of reference to food in terms of ethnicity markers, something that I also discussed in the work of Monica Meneghetti, who wrote also a little story, Biting the Parmesan, for the anthology Here and Now, but also is famous for a memoir, What a Mouse Wants. And in Monica Meneghetti, there is this idea of reclaiming reclaiming the split, or merging the split that I just talked about in Coraggio, that is also present in many other writers, female writers, by queering the food, queering the kitchen. So through memories of food and memories of food recreated with her queer family, her polyamorous family, she tries to reclaim the kitchen, to reclaim her desires as bisexual. So she says queering food is reclaiming a space for themselves as queer, in a position, in a place where supposedly wasn't queer, the family home, homophobic family home, by the recreation of that through food and food memories. And finally, and I go just a minute, I just also talked about, I wrote something about Mambo Italiano. We have there as well a lot of hints at ethnicity, what is ethnicity, and specifically in this comedy in which the protagonist comes out to his parent, also outing his lover. So the protagonist Angelo outing his lover Nino to his family. I looked at how the family was using ethnic rituals to come to terms with this news, you know, the shocking news that the son was gay. And now these rituals, the ethnic schemata, actually help them to come to terms with that. So ethnicity also, I looked at the way in which the coming out of Nino was queering also the family home, queering the parents in a way that they realized they were also a bit queer because they were a bit strange as well in the country, and they reassessed their immigration history, etc. And in doing that, accept also the strangeness of so-called strangeness of their son. So this is basically what I've been doing. And the motivation that brought me to that were really related to the fact that I grew up and thinking that, you know, my gender, the expectation related to my gender didn't really coincide with what I was as a non-heterosexual woman. So for me, there was also this split because I moved to the UK, so I experienced the history, sort of history of migration. So these were the topics I was really kind of interested on. I wanted to know what other writers or the women had done in order to come to terms with that and live a more meaningful life. And challenges, of course, are many, and challenges for many. I don't live in Canada, so for me also keep working on this material would be better if I had the possibility also to be there. And certainly challenges are many. Maybe we can talk about that a bit more in the discussion. But for example, what I see from my also research on activism, feminist activism in Italy, there's a lot of focus on precarity and neoliberalism, and something that probably mainly could be also reworked and worked in the literature I've been talking about, so queer Italian Canadian literature. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Ryan Calabretta-Sajder. He's an assistant professor of Italian at the University of Arkansas, where he also serves as interim director of gender studies. He's also affiliate faculty in comparative literature and cultural studies, as well as Jewish studies there. Research focuses on queer and feminist theories in contemporary Italian and Italian-American literature and film, including Italian Jewry. He's the author of Divergenze in celluloide, colore, migrazione e identità sessuale nei film gay di Fernand Ozpetek. He's editor of Pasolini's Lasting Impressions, Death, Eros, and Literary Enterprise in the opus of Pier Paolo Pasolini, and co-editor of Italian Americans on Screen, Challenging the Past, Retheorizing the Future. He's president of the American Association of Teachers of Italian and Gamma Kappa Alpha, the Italian Collegiate National Honor Society. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you so much. So Abril asked us to look at some questions. So I organized my little presentation today between the questions that were asked and some research stuff. And I'm very happy to say not only am I interim director of gender studies right now, but I'm also formerly associate director, which is going to be a long standing piece. So moving on, a bit about me. I came out at 22. I was much thinner and younger looking then in grad school, and I was kind of outed by my colleagues in French. And that kind of led me to finally accept my identity and realize who I was and what the future was going to hold for me. And while I was in graduate school, I fell in love with Ferzan Ozpetek, who is a Turkish-Italian gay director, who we can talk about later. But through studying Ozpetek, I came to a lot of these questions of gender, transnationalism, which obviously has a lot to do with what we're talking about today with this ethnicity and ethnicity studies, migration studies, diaspora studies, food, which also came up a lot already today in the previous presentation, color, etc. And for the diasporic side, I was lucky to study with both Peter Bondanel and Anthony Julian Tamburi, which really grounded me in my concepts of ethnicity and diversity. And I was lucky because although I had, not Anthony, but other traditional advisors in my graduate study, I was always encouraged, at least on the level of my advising group, to do what I want and to write about what I always believed in, but it has definitely come with consequences over my career in academia, and we can chat about that later if you're interested. So the first questions were, what were gender, what were ethnicity? And although gender is a construct, and we have to go back to Judith Butler, and I start Judith Butler because she's by far not the first person to talk about this. She is only the first person to become kind of known for this and to write a complete text on it. I think it's a basis for not only gender, but also the discussion of ethnic studies that we're talking about today. But I much more prefer a lesser known theorist, Judith Roof, with whom I taught with at Rice University. And she looks at gender as a verb and as something that we do. And I think this also pairs much better with the concept that gender is something that's in flux, and it changes with time, and it changes with place, and it changes with community. And so I like to use Roof more when I teach the graduate level course on queer theories at the University of Arkansas. It's kind of my baby, and we spent a lot of time on the Roof kind of. We also look at Butler and her school, but we look at Roof because it's a little less known these days, and how it starts through Bersani and Edelman, and how we then get to Judith. Ethnicity, how do we define ethnicity in its role? I think ethnicity is part tradition and part construction. And I think that complicates things in very different ways, because we have this then intersectionality, right? That Crenshaw mentions in 1989, that kind of died for a long time. And then sociologists came back to the forefront and started talking about all of this intersectionality. And then of course we know what happened with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and all this kind of stuff. Intersectionality has now become much more central. I think these questions have always been going on, this concept of intersectionality and how we can't just look at things in microcosms, but we have to accept the macrocosm and look cross-referentially throughout what we do and how we think about things. But so I think there's a lot to be said about gender, ethnicity, and how they do work together, but then how they are actually very separate and unique depending on the community one is at. For example, we say Italian Americans in the United States, which often forgets our friends in Canada, right? Notice that the title of this presentation was in North America. So, but to underscore the other aspect, right? There are different experiences, largely because of time, but also because of place, right? And we can leave that for discussion later. I just love the gender unicorn. Anytime I give a kind of general perspective of, what is gender, I think this is a great place to start and to get people thinking, and images are always great, and who doesn't love a purple unicorn? So here's a visual to help you kind of think of where my concepts of gender begin. This is only a beginning. The gender unicorn is actually quite old these days and has evolved also. But another interesting visual of identity I found was this kind of web, and this brings me back to the days of the 2000s. I don't know how many of you remember. I can't see anyone because all I can see is Abril, the way I'm presenting on my screen. But it reminds me of the L word, right? When we tried to chart who was having relations with whom and all of these kinds of back and forths. But this is actually very interactive, and there's a video that goes with this. So you definitely should Google it, it'll come up right away. But, we see these binary concepts on the right and the left, and then we see everything in between, all of this gender fluid. And the more and more that I teach gender studies, and the more and more that I teach in general, I notice that our students have changed a lot when it comes to this concept. Also when we talk about ethnicity, we're adding different layers, but even in the state of Arkansas, which, as many of you probably have heard, is a rather conservative place, the students are much more gender fluid than one would ever expect. We had I'm very active on campus with the Lavender Society and Lavender Graduation, and we had a freshman kind of welcome to college orientation just for students who identify as queer, and the room was not large enough. We had to find another room. So, and there were more people who visually identify as women than as male. So I think that's also really interesting, that things are really changing. They're changing rather quickly. But also, there are lots of things in the center here that we kind of forget about. So I think it's good to return to this image at some point. So my relationship with gender and work, it's funny because I say I do queer, feminist and queer theory, and and I do some feminism, and I just sent off an article that's very feminist in nature on Nuovo Mondo, but my work is really much more queer, whether it is queering traditional texts. I'm working on a piece on Pasolini right now where I'm queering not only time and space in Accattone, Mamma Roma, and Teorema, but also queering the body, which is really interesting. And the body politic in Pasolini is a work that has actually gone all the way back to Giordana Bruna in the late 80s, late 90s. So it's not completely new, but it's the use of queer theory and not just body politics. But so from very early on, my research was very heavy into queerness, and my current work that I'm trying to finish, Beyond the Margin, within the canon novels of Amara Lacus, who wouldn't necessarily seem to be someone you would talk about queer, and I don't necessarily talk about queer, but I have an entire chapter on how he genders the giallo and how he genders the characters and how he deals with these migrant characters, but in Italy, and how they interact with the community they come to, the hopes that they bring with them, and then what happens. And an article that talks about two of his novels, actually just hot off the presses in an edited volume with Graziella Parati and Marie Orton. My big baby that I can't wait to get to, I've been publishing little articles here and there on it, is Robert Ferro, Dandyism, AIDS, and Italian Americana. Robert Ferro is the first, supposedly the first American novelist who wrote a book on AIDS that wasn't memoir. And he was Italian American. He died of AIDS complications in 1988. And that was within 60 days of his partner, Michael Grumley, who was also part of this writing group called the Violet Quill. So my work always has a very close relationship to it. And I also, there was a question of the challenges of dealing with this field. I like to play with theory. When I teach theory classes, I always say, convince me, right? You have the tools at your hand. You can probably make any argument you want. You have to use theory and you have to use the text, and let's see how it goes. So I like to push the envelope. I like to challenge older theories and older works, as well as look at some new stuff. So gender ethnicity, are they actually intricately bound together? I think it's a double-edged sword. I think yes and no. We have some very good examples of how it is. And then you have some really great examples of how it's not. I think with these new sub-schools in queer theory, like Crip theory, Latinx queer theory, Black queer theory, these are what's being published on the most, especially Black queer theory these days. Every year there's a new volume that comes out, or two or three, or anthology. And this is one of my faves, and it's already old. It's like 3 or 4 years old. And this is the actual editor, E. Patrick Johnson, who is at Northwestern University in Performance Studies. So you actually, I think you have a lot of yes and a lot of no. We can go back and talk about Mambo Italiano, for example. I think it's a great idea that Michela mentioned earlier. The private nature of research, is it problematic for the scholar? I don't find it problematic for the scholar, except for the fact that I can tell you numerous stories of jobs that I did not get because I was clearly gay because of the research that I've done. But that's a choice that I have. I can always stay in the traditional scholarship if I so choose. But I think it's much more a commentary by the authors themselves, Peter Corvino, Frank Spinelli, Steve Galluccio. These are 3 that I'm looking at in this actual moment. And I think it's their work that's a sign of activism and not necessarily the scholarship. I'm coming to a close. Why do we do this research, and how do we respond to it? Why is it important? Why do we do it? I think for me, whether it's subconsciously or consciously, probably both, to break down these concepts of fear and hate towards the community. We know that in the migrant communities, in certain regards, it's even more difficult because we come from these cultures that are wrapped up in other aspects of religion and class structure and all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely difficult. I think it's an issue of not forgetting the past. Robert Ferro, for example, was an amazing author during his day. People read him and no one knows who Robert Ferro is today. And I think it's an approach to building a better future. And the response, what do we want you all to do, or what do you all need to do? Review our work, teach our work, challenge our work. I love when people challenge me and my approaches. Buy our work, which is important, because if you don't buy books, they don't get published. And share work with the community, with people, with others. novel ways about writing gender. This is a question that Ilaria proposed to us. I'm not even sure we're there yet, Ilaria, and this is a great question that I think we'll talk about at the end of the talk. I mean, I'm worried that we're not even at the way to focus on creative ways. I think we need to start doing it at this point, but, you know, I think creative methods are always welcome. You know, there are some queer theorists in Italy, for example, who many of us know, who are very much anti-queering time and space, because they argue that if we can't talk about queer bodies and queer works in and of themselves, we can't even get to this concept of queering time and space. It's not fair to the field to get there yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Ilaria Serra. She was born in Venice, Italy. She's a professor of Italian and comparative studies at Florida Atlantic University. She's the author of several articles and chapters on Italian cinema, literature, and migration, and the books Immagini di un Imaginario, l'emigrazione italiana negli Stati Uniti fra I due secoli, The Value of Worthless Lives, Writing Italian-American Immigrant Autobiographies, and The Imagined Immigrant, Images of Italian Immigration to the US between 1890 and 1924. She authored the language and culture book Italia Cantata, 2 centuries of Italian history through music, and has finished a manuscript in English on the same topic. At FAU, she coordinates the digital humanities projects titled Italian American Oral History Archive, the Italian American Memories Documentary Archive, and Floritalians. She also organizes the FAU Italian and Italian American Film Festivals and the annual International Symposium Italy in Transit. In 2008, she founded a 6-week summer study abroad program in Venice that she leads every year. And she collaborates with the Gallio Film Festival delle Opere Prime, which takes place on the Asiago Plateau every July. That sounds amazing. Thanks, Ilaria. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Abril, for organizing this very interesting panel. In fact, I was literally looking forward to hearing what everybody had to say, and I think it's going to be really interesting. I speak from the land of the Seminole, Indians, and the Spanish conquistadores, and the Jewish American immigrants from the north. So I'm speaking from Boca Raton, Florida, in this moment. My approach is going to be exactly on the research side. In fact, I took your invitation to reflect about how to write and how to research topics of gender and ethnicity. So that's going to be my focus, speaking about what I did in the past. For me, it's very important to be very concrete and interdisciplinary in the research that we do. And so I constructed this presentation around the images and the metaphors that I used in the past for my research to speak about gender and ethnicity together. Okay, I went too fast. No. So the first image I want to speak about is the Imaginario, which is the production of mental images about a subject, which in this case was the Italian American, mental images that find concrete representation. So my first research was exactly to find the concrete representation of the perceived image and given image of the Italian American, thinking that it's not just a person, but it's also exactly what it projects, an image. So the images that I considered were the autobiographies, the self-images of popular in the sense of folk, illiterate sometimes authors, the letters that they wrote, so giving an image to their families, the image that they chose to give, often fake. The interviews in Ellis Island, stories that they told about their past in Ellis Island microfilms, images of cinema, the first films that were made on immigrants, Italian immigrants, the image that they gave out, and then the newspapers, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, these research that I did in a certain time period. So this is how I started. Then I went to ethnicity and self-images instead in the autobiographies by ordinary people. I think we all share this idea of giving voice to people who don't have a traditionally voice. So I decided to go to look for life stories of people who wanted to tell their story, even if they didn't have anything to boast, even if they didn't make this huge success in life. So I found more than I thought. And the first one actually came knocking at my door, an ice cream maker from Sicily who says, I really need somebody to type this up, translate it, because I want to live my story and I don't know how. So I invented this specific name to speak about this type of subject. The quiet individual, which is the author of a narrative about the self, told sotto voce rather than shouted in triumph, rather than the individualism of the fighter, which is very American type of autobiographical eye. Rather than the individualism that of the fought and detained by life. Accustomed to protect and defend themselves from the blows of fortune, they aim to protect their life between two cheap covers in the book. They are all obsessed with this idea of having the book. And these are the places where I looked for this type of writings. This is another recent turn in my scholarship. I really try to be as concrete as possible. And I found these amazing Voyagers by Bruno Catalano, the sculptures, and I tried to use them as metaphors to speak of the language of the poets, Italian poets as the diaspora, an amazing anthology that is a thick book that goes throughout all the poets in Italian and Italians in Australia, in the UK, in Africa, in South and North America, so in the whole diaspora. And I mentioned here two of the poems that express exactly this kind of divided self and sometimes this whole inside that I think you also may relate to, even just looking at it. And one is Joseph Tuziani, Two Languages, Two Lands, Perhaps Two Souls, Am I a Man, or Two Strange Halves of One? And then another Italian in Croatia, If I don't perceive the connection, if the beginning I don't see, if it's there. And the end, and if the place where I walk is called maybe, then I suddenly tremble. And I thought this was really striking in the way they illustrate with images these poetic words. Another images that I try to use for theory is considering Italian American poets, the winners of the Ciardi Prize. And how they are the citizens of an abandoned country. So I went to look to at their poems, and I saw how these Italian Americans live in the symbolic space of these towns. For them, the town they have left is this type of town that we see today somewhere in Italy with their disintegrated landmarks. They are the absent citizens, and the way they speak about this is with if I had remained, if I had been, now I'm the citizen that could have been. So these hypothetical tenses that they use. And my sources were the poets themselves and their poems, and these abandoned towns in Italy, the ghost towns. And I found metaphors like the missing link between the two arches, the two sides of the arch, or the crumbling steps of this image, or the submerged town. This is Curone, where you only see the sign, a visible sign, like an accent, Divide Giunta would say, of ethnicity, of what could have, of what was and is not there anymore. And then the last part I used JR art installation in Ellis Island, in the psychiatric hospital and the hospital side, and Robert Viscusi's Ellis Island, very postmodern poem. Another image, go next, is the image of impermanence that I used to consider Luis de Salvo memoir on moving, where she looks at herself and her instability through the addresses that she lived in. And I found as a metaphor this very Italian engineering construction, the livable bridge. There are no other examples in the world that I know of places, of bridges where you can actually stand and stay and live. And not just covered, like in the States, covered bridges, but habitable bridges. So I found this as a very striking metaphor to speak about her. The bridge helps Luis de Salvo in an unsteady moment of her life when she needs to give a sense of her apparently nonsensical moves. It dangerously stands on the void, but at the same time, it provides shelter and safety, like a temporary home. So it's an image of impermanence that's stable. This is my article on Italian American femininities for the Routledge history. And I spoke of Italian American memoirs, but I cataloged them in rooms, in the rooms of a house. Italian American women memoirs open traditionally locked doors. In order to delineate Italian American femininities, I chose an itinerary through memoirs that passes through the doors of their homes that usually are locked. When Italian American women write their story, they open them candidly in a very strong, very effective way. And the last step is the embroidered images. This is my final, most recent article, and it puts together needlework and the feminine in Adriana Trigiani's novels. And I'm taking the idea from Edvige Junt and Joseph Shora, the embroidery stories that they wrote, the anthology. Embroidery and stitching have recently entered in the scholarly and artistic realm in Italian American studies as signifying cultural metaphors. And this essay employs embroidered samples as literary rhetorical devices to reflect, to explain Trigiani's peculiar storytelling style, geared to exalt several generations of working people and especially working women. And a word also on the embroidery part. These samples are the samples that were gathered here at Florida Atlantic University among women of the community, and we sent them all to Anne-Marie Trasciatti in New York, who is constructing this amazing memorial for the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where many Italian women and Jewish women lost their lives. And they asked for embroidery and meaningful stitched work from women that related to that, to the sacrifice of these working women. So I use these samples to explain different facets of Adriana Trigiani's work in her novel. So I'm looking forward now to hearing other ways to approach gender and ethnicity, and this is my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ilaria. It's really very interesting to see. I'm actually just teaching the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire to my students, so it's timely for me as well. Okay, let's move on to our last speaker for today. Licia Canton earned a PhD in literature at Université de Montréal and an MA at McGill. She's co-founder and editor-in-chief of Accenti Magazine. Her writing, fiction, essays, poetry has been anthologized in English, French, Chinese, Italian, and Venetian. She's authored 2 collections of short story, The Pink House and Other Stories, and Almond Wine and Fertility. Dr. Canton has published 11 books as editor, including the groundbreaking volume, Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing, which we heard about a little bit earlier, and I hope to hear a little bit more. She's the editor of the documentary film Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian Canadian. And she's currently Emilio Goggio Research Fellow in Italian Canadian Studies at the University of Toronto. She was visiting professor and writer in residence at the University of Calabria in 2019, and honorary fellow in translation at the University of Hull in the UK from 2018 to 2021. And since 2010, she's directed an internship program at Accenti Magazine that oversees the work of students from Bishop's University. Licia Canton is currently president of the Association of Italian Canadian Writers, and in recognition of her work in Italian Canadian culture, Dr. Canton received the Italy in the World Prize, Premio Italia nel Mondo, in 2018. Welcome, Licia.
Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm located on unceded Indigenous lands. Jojage, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Thank you, Abril. Thanks to the panelists. I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about the Queer Italian Canadian project, which I've been working on for the last 2 years or so. Before this, for about 15 years, my focus was Italian Canadian women's writing. So queer Italian Canadian writing is a new literary corpus of exploration for me. The project thus far includes the documentary, the anthology, as well as a series of online events, some of which are on YouTube, and a social media campaign. The documentary, Creative Spaces, is 28 minutes long and was released in March of this year. The volume Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing, was published in June 2021, and it includes the writing of 38 contributors. And with this project, and when I say project, I mean the film and the volume, we take on subjects that are not traditionally discussed in the Italian Canadian community. And I say we because I've been fortunate to have the support of a number of individuals, organizations, and experts for different parts of the project. So let me tell you a little bit about how I came to this project. I'm very involved in the Italian Canadian community, and that is for the last 30 years, not growing up. Specifically on the cultural and literary scene as a creative writer, a magazine editor, and organizer of events. I operate at the junction of the artistic, academic, and business communication communities without fully belonging to any one of these. I was born in Italy and arrived in Montreal at the age of 4. I have a very strong connection to my roots. I grew up in Montreal North, went to a high school where 90% of the students were of Italian heritage. I raised my children in Saint-Léonard, which is the place in Canada with the greatest number of Italian speakers. For those of you who know the Toronto area, Woodbridge and Vaughan, according to the last census, has the greatest number of residents who identify as being of Italian heritage, but Saint-Léonard in Montreal has the greatest number of Italian speakers or dialect speakers. I had friends who left Montreal in the 1980s because they were gay. Back then, a child of Italian immigrant parents could not or would not speak openly to their parents and family. And I was surprised to hear from my children, 2 of whom belong to the LGBTQ+ community, young adults, that some of their own Italian Canadian friends in their 20s as well are still reluctant to speak openly to their parents and even to their friends. It's still not a topic for Sunday lunch with the whole family, as Anthony Portolese describes in his very touching personal essay in the anthology Here and Now. First, let me tell you about the documentary Creative Spaces. It was screened publicly and virtually only once at an event hosted by U of T's, U of Toronto's Frank Iacobucci Center. The documentary includes interviews with Montreal writers Steve Galluccio, Chris Dorado, and Liana Kuzmanov, and commentary by scholar Dominic Beneventi. All 4 of them participated in the roundtable discussion after the first screening at U of T, organized and hosted by Paolo Frasca. The documentary is made possible by the Queer Studies in Quebec Research Group, headed by Professor Beneventi at the University of Sherbrooke, as well as the Association of Italian Canadian Writers, the AICW. My gratitude to past presidents Seccia and DeSantis. The cinematographers, Justine Rivard and Beatrice Langlois-Bethez, were students in cinema at the University of Montreal. And I was inspired to interview queer Italian Canadian writers after having read Monica Meneghetti's essay in the Globe and Mail in May 2018. The title is I'm Queer and Italian Canadian, Coming Out Was Twice as Hard. The initial plan was to interview about 10 writers. Why 10? Because those are the ones that we knew of or had identified. So to interview these writers in different parts of Canada and create a video. So my expertise is literature and books, but I wanted to do a film instead of a book in order to reach a wider audience, different generations, multiple communities. Writers in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver had agreed to be interviewed. Of course, I began in Montreal for obvious reasons. COVID hit, we had a deadline to use funds. We changed gear and produced a film that is different than my original intention, but a good start, I think. I look forward to interviewing other writers as soon as possible. The film was only screened publicly once, but it has been used in classrooms and at non-public virtual events. This is unusual, of course, and contrary to my reasoning for doing a film to reach more people, and it's all because of the pandemic. Let me say a few words about the volume, Here and Now, the groundbreaking anthology of queer Italian-Canadian writing. It is the most comprehensive collection yet, but there will be many more, I am sure. To be included in the book, a contributor did not have to write about being queer or of Italian heritage, but they had to identify as belonging to both communities, although I must say that there are 3 contributors who are allies. The volume features fiction, nonfiction, poetry. The contributors are established and prize-winning authors, as well as emerging writers. For some, this is their first publication. Some are using pseudonyms. The creative contributions are introduced by 3 scholars, Dominic Beneventi, Michela Baldo, and Paolo Frasca. I am extremely grateful to them for their 3-part introduction, for supporting this project in general. The volume is a milestone in Canadian literature, and it fills a gap within Italian-Canadian studies. Although many of the contributors are well known as Canadian writers, they may not be easily recognized as being of Italian heritage. The project as a whole, the film and volume, proposes a more complete and inclusive account of the Italian-Canadian community's reality and its contribution to the arts in Canada. It calls out the hesitation with which matters of sexual and gender diversity are discussed in the Italian-Canadian community. I mentioned the supporters of the film before. The volume had so much more support. Let me mention again the Queer Studies in Quebec Research Group, the Frank Iacobucci Center at University of Toronto, the University of Calabria, the AICW, the English Language Arts Network, the Mariano A. Elia Chair at York, Longbridge Books, and Accenti, key individuals, Chris Dorado, Liana Kuzmanov, Anthony Portulese, Leanne Moyes, Professor Beneventi, Professor Frasca. At the start, I thought I could use my position within the Italian-Canadian literary community to bring some attention to writers and artists whose voices and experiences often go unnoticed, particularly in the community that they originate from. The project should encourage conversations beyond literary, artistic, and academic circles. It could be useful to educators and researchers, but certainly also to members of the Italian diaspora, to families, parents, grandparents, their children. I hope that it would help us all to rethink of what it means to be Italian-Canadian. Of course, there is still a lot of work to be done. And in fact, I've started fundraising for a 2nd film and a 2nd volume. And in the meantime, I hope that the Queer Italian-Canadian Project will inspire other projects, many events and conversations that will lead to more inclusivity. And we've already seen signs of that. For instance, Professor Frasca is the principal investigator of a research team at U of T. And that has come out of the original project. So they are eventually going to interview all the contributors from Here and Now. I hope that people would be interested in seeing the documentary, in reading the volume, not just buying it, but also reading it, maybe offer it as a gift to someone that it could help change someone's life or change someone's perspective. Ultimately, the objective is to speak and to collaborate and to make it easier for everyone to be themselves. And now if we have 2 minutes left, Abril, maybe we can watch the 2-minute trailer of Creative Spaces. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Licia. I'm gonna just share my screen here. And please just unmute if you can't hear or if there's any difficulty, because I won't be able to see you.
So do I look relaxed? Is it okay?
No, you look really relaxed.
So my name is Christopher Dorado.
Liana Kuzmanov.
Lucio, and I was born in Montreal, in Little Italy, actually.
The safest place that I have felt being queer in any way was while writing.
But I knew that growing up that I was a little afraid to kind of reveal this part of myself to the Italian side of my family.
Even my Italian friends are like, "You're never going to make it." My extended family, "You're never going to make it." It's not for, because it's not for us.
So many people will challenge you and ask you to justify yourself. Why are you here? Who are you? Prove to me that you're trans and that you deserve to occupy this public space.
In my 20s, I was hidden. I was in the closet from my family.
And I'm not going to show up to my grandmother's house and like gender myself correctly. It's awful every time.
You're not supposed to be gay. That's changed a lot.
I can remember being, as a kid, really being afraid about my future.
But I knew that I would never be able to constrain myself. So many of us were raised to live in a world that doesn't exist anymore.
You know, given enough time, you will find your tribe and you will find people who will love you for you.
I can tell like I'm part of something that's bigger than me, and I can help other people hopefully feel like they're part of something that's bigger than them.
I guess I did belong, but I just didn't know it.
I can see the love she will have for me, a love deeper than anything I've ever felt from a man. And that scares me, frightens me that I can do all of those things I do to men, press my body up against theirs in a variety of different ways. But no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to get them to stay inside. I can't make them love me. And with my mother, there is no effort. It's just there, as constant and infinite as the universe.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do you want me to read it again, or that was fine?
That was perfect.
Okay.
That's great.
Thank you so much, Licia. That was wonderful. Thank you to all of our panelists for a lot of really great food for thought already. So now that we've heard from our speakers, we're going to move into the discussion portion of the section. Each of your work spans a wide variety of topics, and we've kind of touched on some of them here now. Queer activism, we've talked about food, music, family, and so I'm wondering, how does gender to you intersect with those topics? How do you either decide to incorporate it into your work? Is it kind of a distinct topic, or is it kind of something that folds in naturally? How do you make those decisions?
Maybe I can start, so then I'll leave since I just finished on this. For me, integrating gender into my writing certainly probably was something that happened a bit later in my kind of curriculum. I was doing a PhD on Italian Canadian writing, no focuses especially on that national gender. And then at the same time, of course, I kind of got to know myself better. I came out, and then gender became like probably more prominent in my writing. And so it wasn't really not a conscious decision to integrate gender in that. In a sense, it was more of an unconscious decision. It was just a compelling thing to do because it was what I was working on. I was working on that because I had worked on gender basically all my life. I was reworking on what gender meant and how there was always, you know, this kind of conflict between what how I perceive myself and how, you know, gender roles had applied to me, and specifically because, you know, of my being a lesbian. So this has always been there, but then I possibly later on, because I became more vocal about also this, I became also involved in activism in Italy. Then, you know, the idea of writing more about gender was like more a compelling thing, because also my evolving persona might be more politicized by also being part of collectives in Italy when I could, of course, because at time I was also in the possibility of continuing what I had started, and also in the UK, partially also in the UK with the group of Women's Strike Assembly more recently. So it was something that came as part, without really consciously thinking of doing that, but was just something that came out of my political involvement in queer feminist groups, both in Italy and the UK, and therefore also like it was necessary. It wasn't something I said, shall I do or shall I not? Yeah.
Thank you.
I can go next. So gender for me is not, yes, it's not a peculiar choice, a specific choice, but it comes more from my almost moral duty as a researcher. When I do research, I do unearthing of stories. I noticed how women and other genders were completely absent in first studies on the Italian immigrants. So women came after this kind of research. And I think it's really a way of and a problem of giving a voice, and it's still the same. I thought maybe we had improved, but hearing from you, it seems that we still need a lot of work. And one article that I wrote some time ago is titled "Le streghe son tornate," the witches are back, the reappearance of streghe in Italian American queer writing. And it dealt with two of the books that you showed before, Michela, Fuori and Paisa. And what I noticed there, it's this kind of revendication of wanting to leave a trace and to shout in a way that reminded the feminist streghe son tornate mottos of the Italian feminism. And what I did, I went to look at this streghe and what they were, and the Benandanti and the work of Ginsburg history, in Italian history, and they share the same type of being marginal, being burned at the stake, and still wanting to give curses. Still wanted to speak out. And there were different ways in these anthologies where these aspects came out, either with magical thinking, with the replacing of the goddess to the male god in religion, especially Italian Americans, with this reappearance, not just the mother, as you spoke about, as you showed, Licia, in your clip, but the nonna. And so the nonna as the witch, and this kind of finding strength from the previous generations. And that's what I noticed. So I just want to add this to this reflection of gender and my own research.
I just wanted to add a little, comment about the streghe, which is also now a motto, an anthem of the movement Non Una di Meno in Italy. Tremate, le streghe son tornate. So is chanted at various parades, and so it's exactly what you said.
It's like reappropriated in a way, right? And kind of given a different power. Ryan or Licia, did you want to add to that, or?
I can just say that, well, in my creative writing, definitely it's a conscious choice to write women's stories, inspired by the women of my mother's generation and of my generation, sort of caught between what the parents left behind and what we're looking towards in the future. And also in my critical work, whenever I had a chance to publish an essay or give a paper, like I said earlier, in the last 10, 15 years, I focused on women authors who are of Italian heritage in Canada, because I thought that there were enough men writing about men. I myself, now going back, looked at my PhD thesis, and there are 3 male writers and 2 female writers. And of that one male writer, I used 3 of his novels. So I did a lot more work on the men in that project as well. And this one here, this last project, I just felt there was a need. I mentioned Monica Meneghetti's essay in the Globe and Mail. I mentioned speaking to my children, but I was at the events where Monica read only the food part. And I remember emailing her and asking her, why'd you do that? Like, the beauty of the book is, and she was like, I looked at the audience and it was like, nah, she didn't feel that the audience would react well. And I tend to do that as a creative writer, go there and look and see if I see like someone who's been there and has already heard the story I'm about to read, I sort of change my story. And then I don't know why we cater to that, because I've been to Mary Di Michele's reading. She read the same excerpt from the novel 10 times. And every time I listened to it, it was beautiful and it was different. But, there's this sort of like, I don't know why, fear fear. So I'll stop there.
So honestly, my whole love for feminism and queer stuff came out of courses that excluded women authors. I'll never forget one of the first courses I had in graduate school was a course on the novel, and there were no women. And that was the first time that I studied and read Una Donna. And, since then I've published on Una Donna because, Italian studies is so male-centric and heteronormative. The same professor years later, when I asked the person if he was going to include Sandro Penna in a poetry reading that he was going to do, he said, quote, "The only reason you want me to do that is because he's gay." So I think this is very much still an issue in Italian studies. And then, so maybe it was out of anger and rage and activism originally, but now, because queer theory in particular, I still do some feminism, but I really focus so much. There's just so much that needs to be queered in the traditional canon, not to mention the traditional canonical gay Italian writers, that when we even get to the Italian American stuff, 40, the great introduction that was written by Mary Jo Bona at the time was amazing, right? No one has really taken that and brought it to date. I'm working with Alan Gravano on a couple of book projects. One was Italian Americans on Screen, right? The next one's Italian Americans on the Page. And the third is Queer and Italian Americana. And we're really trying to focus more attention on these numerous Italian American authors who are LGBTQ, who have never been written on, like Peter Covino. That's just to name one, right? But Frank Spinelli is a doctor who has 2 novels out at this point already. So, and people have never even heard of, even Galluccio, who we all know because of the film, there's really very little written. And I think there's almost nothing, if not, and nothing on the play itself. So we have a lot of work, I think, to do ahead of us, to get the field up to snuff. And because gender is changing, right, and there is this evolution, it's also difficult, I think, as queer theory scholars to keep up with it. I go to the MLA every year and I come home with roughly 7 books published this year between NYU, Duke, and University of Minnesota Press on updated concepts of queer theory. And another thing I think that we're really lacking behind is we don't want to collaborate with other migrant groups, African Americans, Latinx. We have so much in common. I've been using a lot of Munoz's concept of disidentification lately to talk about different things. One of the Italian scholars in our Italian Americans on the Page, Cristina De Maio, is talking about Gloria Anzaldúa and how her theories work very well with Janet Capone's poetry. So there's a lot that we can collaborate on, I think, that already exists.
And there's some good observations in the chat as well, kind of to support your points, Ryan. The next question I have, and I think you've all already touched on it today, and certainly your work touches on it, is about how gender can be for a lot of people a very private topic. I think, Ilaria, you mentioned kind of the opening of traditionally locked doors. Ryan, you've written about queer lives being represented in film in a very public way. And Michela and Licia, certainly your work also speaks to this idea of kind of what's withheld or private or hidden. So I'm just curious, is this sometimes writing about it or doing the work you're doing sheds more light on it and makes it more public? And I'm wondering, is this a conscious choice? Where do you situate yourself in that? Is it useful? What are your thoughts around this issue of privacy?
Well, I can say that for me, it's a really conscious choice. I want to shake up the Italian Canadian community, especially the one in Montreal. I think, the researchers, the scholars, they're doing the work that needs to be done. Sure, there could be more work being done, but I can give you an example. You mentioned Ryan Steve Galluccio. I just went to this exhibit Italians in Montreal, and they featured 131 people from all fields, you know, their picture and what they did and whatever. And I was surprised to see that Steve Galluccio is not there, you know, but Vittorio Rossi, who's also a playwright and has been, you know, his plays have been put up at Centaur and is there. And at that same exhibit, I mean, I am there, and so is Liana. So I'm, you know, grateful for that. But there are a lot of people missing. Of course, not everyone can be included, but there is nothing about Steve Galluccio or gays or queers or lesbians in that exhibit. There's a lot of food. There's a lot of, you know, the barber's tools. Like we did that 20 years ago in Ottawa. And I remember when they asked for my picture to be included in this exhibit, I sent them my trailer and asked if we could include this trailer. This is really important. It's only 2 minutes. You could even take like 15 seconds. There are a lot of trailers there. A lot of trailers. So I can't help but think, you know, and it's true, sometimes people say, oh, the program is closed. Did the same thing for Italian Week. I always have had opportunities to either feature writers at events or have a book stand or, you know, read or give workshops to people. I asked if they would show the film, either virtually or, you know, in person. Program is full. I asked if I could, you know, launch the anthology. The anthology came out in June. This was happening in August. Program is full. So I can't help but think that they're not ready, or at least the people around the boardroom. There are more of them who are not ready.
Thank you. Yeah. Ilaria, did you want to speak to that issue of like the private sphere?
And I'm more reminded of Pirandello and the many faces that we have and how what we want to show, what we want to not show. And I still think it's a very personal decision. But as the audience being accepting and ready, that is a very important aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about our situation here in Florida, but I think also maybe one secret could be the cross disciplines, and so really speak about different ethnicities and not just ours. I think maybe a secret in opening up is also that one, different genders, different ethnicities. So more of a crossroad type of self-translating even. So if a verb exists for gender and for ethnicity, that could be really translation or related to translation.
And this is a good segue to another question that I have for you, which is, are gender and ethnicity inextricably bound together? Can we talk about one without talking about the other?
I think we can. I like to play with theory, so I think you can do whatever you want with theory. Now, is there some level of, I think there's always some sort of overlap, right? Whether we're talking about, you know, social class and, you know, gender touches on all of these things and roles and et cetera, et cetera. But I think they can be treated separately. I think there are moments when maybe we should treat them separately, but in general, I think when we're looking at the holistic perspective, right, it's better to probably look at them together. However, I also think that we also need to be careful because we all come from very different perspectives. There's a huge difference between looking at representations of ... and real life ... right? I know Michela works in language. Licia does, you know, a whole broad range of things, but some documentary and creative writing. Ilaria starts from the autobiography, which is also very interesting. You know, is it fiction or is it not? Where does one start and one end? So I think that also really has to be taken into consideration when we're talking about gender. Because, you know, when I look at the Joey character in my friend's article, which you brought up a couple of times, you know, that's a representation. We're laughing, it's stereotyped, right? And that has its own different connotations, positive and negative. But there's also different experience when we talk about the documentary, when we see and hear some of the writers that Licia's working with and all that kind of stuff. So And I also think that representative arts needs to also have a sociological reference point, maybe, or us as folks who do lit and media crit also need to tune in maybe a bit more to what's going on in the sociological world. Affect theory, you know, we have queer theorists that do affect theory, but it hasn't really come into queer theory completely yet. So that's also like an interesting brink of what may happen in the near future. So anyway, I don't know if that was helpful or not. But.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add to this question before we move on?
Well, yes, I wanted to say for me, they are really very much bound to each other. I was interesting to see maybe what Ryan could say about about the perspectives of whom or people who could see them detached. But for me, for example, talking about gender without talking about ethnicity it's kind of there's something missing, because the ethnicity has to do with race, has to do with a lot of other characteristics, and then it's useful to know what, for example, how a lot of other things related to gender are nuanced because of the belonging to a certain category, ethnic category, because it has to do, is linked to a lot of other topics, like also poverty, economic precarity, etc. So being, for example, a black woman is different from being, for example, a white woman in a certain setting. So certainly ethnicity comes in, and it's important that it comes in. Is one of those elements that are important, are pivotal, I think, in defining also what gender might be. And yeah, so for me, they're really inextricably bound, and that's why my research was really starting from the supposedly kind of split between them, caused by the unacceptance of non-heteronormative lives in the communities I analyze in North America, Italian, in communities, in literary writings, because this is what I've done in Italian Canadian and Italian American women's writing mainly. So yes, I wanted also to add something I said before. I didn't really answer to what we said before, the question posed before about gender being like private. Well, the feeling of gender certainly might be a private thing, but gender is so much of a social construct. It has to do with imposition of roles and norms that for me, thinking about privatizing gender is giving a service to patriarchy, which has always worked in a way to make gender violence, but gender-based violence, a private matter. So bringing that to the public, as Licia said, is very important, is necessary in order also to speak about, mainly about violence. We're talking about, in my writing, I've been focusing also on gender violence. So gender violence made by gender, this is also what the feminist movement in Italy talked about, is the gender of the violence of the gender norms that perceive only bodies in binary terms, but also the violence coming from gender identifications. So there are lots of different ways in which we can talk about violence. And because of that, gender is a public matter, and also violence needs to be brought into the public sphere to be able to, fight it. So, yeah.
Not an easy task.
No, not an easy task.
And I think of my own work with conducting oral histories and oral interviews. Those things that are seen as private are not so easy. Ilaria, you might have that with memoir. Licia, I think you've kind of come across that as well. Those stories are not always easy to bring out. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. We could keep going. I have many more questions for you all, but I'd like to open the floor up to our audience members and see if anybody else would like to contribute a question. You can do so by unmuting yourself, or by writing it into the chat or into the Q&A.
So Michela, I'm just going to say, as someone proposes the first question, I think I'm a closeted Marxist. I think in the end, it all goes back to social class first. Everything else, I think it's intersectionally related, but I think the key really to all the problems in society go back to social class structures. But
while I wait for any questions from our audience, I'll keep going with my own or with your own, because the panelists have questions for each other, which is always interesting. So one of the questions we had for the group is it necessary to find novel ways to look at or write about gender or ethnicity? And Ryan, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit.
I did.
You want to expand on that?
This was Ilaria's great question. And, you know, as much as I agree with her, and I think the soul of the question, right, I think that Italian and even Italian American studies is at a point where we still need to create the foundation. I mean, if the foundational essay comes from 83 is 40 or 85, you know, and really no one has really gone back and massaged that out. We have anthologies, which is great, right? And anthologies are an example of activism and all of this really great stuff. But theoretically speaking, and I know Alan is on the call too, we have worked the last couple of MLAs to create these working groups, and we have some senior colleagues in Italian American studies that, no, you have to go back to Italian American studies because we've done it. No, we haven't. We haven't done queer theory. I'm sorry, but we've started to talk about gender issues and issues of gender in theory. And I still think we need to iron some of those out. But and we got a little flack about going outside of, you know, Italianistica and going to our colleagues and friends in Black studies and Latinx studies and, you know, more traditional queer theory to tease out some of these concepts. And I think that's dangerous. I mean, there are some really great things that are already out there that are applicable to us. I'm not saying, I guess this is going back to your earlier question, right? It's interesting how roundtables come back, right? How ethnicity and gender, you know, in this case will probably end up creating a different line, you know, a little different kind of theoretical line from what exists. But there are really great models out there already. And I think we need to start adopting or adapting what is really out there that works and then maybe calling it our own at some point. But, and maybe that's the creative aspect, Ilaria, I don't know, you know.
Yeah, I think probably that one aspect of this creativity is really touching, reaching out. And because yes, Latinx, there is more that in those fields than in ours. We are still struggling with pronouns because we are such a straight jacket language, and we haven't even touched on this that us as in teachers of Italian also have to deal with. And Licia, maybe for you, a novel way is to give images to your words, to your pages, because you're putting a video together with an anthology. Did you think that one was not enough, or?
I thought that the video would reach more people of different generations. In fact, that we have the translation of the transcript into Italian and into French because I'm in Montreal. But we're not there yet. I think my challenge right now is to find ways to show the film and to get people to come and see the film. And yes, it's like I said before, I think I'm very grateful that people, you know, who are researchers and scholars and professors are interested in the film, but I would like to reach beyond that. So I really think the novel way would be to find the people in different communities, and I'm speaking still within the Italian Canadian community, sort of finding a way to bridge the queer community and the Italians in Canada. I don't know if it has to be that you are personally invested in an issue to become more active. I don't think so, because I've seen people who have no personal connection to the queer community and be really supportive, and vice versa. I've reached out to people that I know who have children who are queer and who are in positions to help, hoping, without clearly asking them or saying, I know that you have a child who is queer, thinking that they would be the first people to, to be supportive, and they weren't. So I've been surprised at where I got the
to La
support.
Bella Figura, right? We're returning to the Mambo Italiano mentality of La Bella Figura.
Yes, but yeah, decades later, like I said earlier, my kids are in their 20s, they're all adults. I'm shocked. I'm doing this for my kids. I'm doing this for my parents. I mean, I don't think it's too late for my parents' generation to wake up. Steve Galluccio says it. Zero tolerance for, well, they're old, you're not going to change them. I'm sorry. Do you want to come to Christmas gatherings and pretend, that that person doesn't exist? Like Dominic Beneventi in the film talks about the culture of silence. You can come, and you can come with your partner to the wedding, but don't make any waves. Don't give any indication that you're a couple. Dominic says something about, the weight that the word l'amico carries. Viene con il suo amico. You're never going to say partner or whatever. So that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know if I'm the best person to do this. I'm hoping that this start will bring other people in the community to sort of say, okay, well, Licia, you've done this. How about I take over now? I mean, I don't necessarily have to be the editor of the second volume. I'm starting the work, but I'm hoping somebody else will step in. Maybe somebody younger, somebody better connected. I mean, also there's the issue of doing projects like this for me is while you're doing the project and looking for the writers or setting it up with the filmmakers, you also have to go and find the money and knock on a lot of doors.
That was my next question. Did you get any grant funding for any of these projects? Because that's important too.
Well, the Dominic Beneventi's group and the ASCW funded the film. I mentioned all the funders for the anthology, but I started off, I start and then hope the money will come, and that's not a good business plan, right? So it's not a good, I can tell you it's not a good business plan. I should have been really wealthy and then I could have done whatever I wanted. But I've started the work on the second film. I've started work on the second volume, and what they say, prepare the meal and hope that they come. So that's what I'm doing. What I said earlier in the 10 minutes was that all along this project, I have felt at times very uncomfortable. I've only gotten positive feedback. I know that, other people connected to the project have gotten negative feedback. Some people, are not interested, and not just are not interested, would rather you not be working on this project. Like I did an interview for a very big media platform, and the interview was never aired. So I don't know why. I mean, I devoted half a day outside, in the park in the wintertime, answering questions with the whole crew. And that was February. It's nowhere, and I'm very upset about that. And I'm grateful, for instance, to Omni. If you look up Omni and Queer Italian Canadian or Here and Now, they've done a few segments. And so there is progress, because in 2011, when Adriana Monti did her film and included Elena Basile, and she was speaking on lesbian issues, Omni then refused to air that film. And now they are looking to participate, to help. So there is progress.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're running out of time here. So I have so many more questions for all of you, and some questions that have come in that we won't be able to get to, unfortunately. Maybe we can continue by email. But before we sign off, I just wanted to give each of you 30 seconds to give us a shameless plug. Either you can chat with us or throw in any links into the chat for our members here. If there's anything you want people to know that you're working on that's coming up, or any websites or emails that you want to put out to the group, anybody want to give us their shameless plug?
I'll start with the shameless plug. So we're working on Italian Americans on the Page, which should be out sometime next year. And then our next project that's in process is Queering Italian Americana. And we're hoping both of those to come out with SUNY Press. So we're working on those pretty diligently to get them out and about. But I just wanted to also highlight, I see that there are some graduate students here, and that makes me very happy because you are the future. And you know, some of us are already old, and those of you who know me never know that I never call myself old. So, but anyway, I'm getting old. So it's going to be your task really to bring the field to task. So I'm really glad to see that we have some graduate students. I know there's at least 2 or 3 from Wisconsin. It makes me very happy. So stick to it. Don't let your advisor tell you you can't do it. I think the field is changing. Look at all of the publications that are coming out. Look at the new journals, right? GSI was brand new when I was coming on the market, right? And now it's a stellar journal. So when people say, don't place your first article in a gender studies volume, or don't do this and don't do, oh yeah, I've heard a lot of that. Don't use online publication platforms because they're not going to count for job market and tenure. The field is changing. And I think my generation, Ilaria, Michela, Abril, we're starting to change things as we are now associate and higher. So I do think we will have a future, and I think that our voices will be heard. And not only will it be heard, but they'll be appreciated, right? I think there's a huge difference. Our voices have been heard because we made them heard, but because of all of the static that's happening in the world, I think our voices are being respected more and more, even slowly, but I think it's occurring. So thank you.
I agree. Thanks, Ryan. And I see Licia put some of her links onto the chat, so make sure to check them out before we close out. Michela or Ilaria, anything you're working on that you want people to know about?
I'm working on music, so
super interesting.
Yes, music and Italian history. So it's kind of on the side. But I was fascinated that Licia came up again with the idea of the family, with a family, Italian family that needs to open up, even in this small, instead of changing the field, it's changing the world, as we were saying. Now it's still, we have to go back to this Italian unit of identity, which is the family. I like that, Licia. Okay.
So true. Michela, anything to add?
Yes, for me, I'm mainly working at the moment on the translation of activist, the anthem, The Rapist Is You, the famous anthem that became replicated in many branches of the Nuna di Meno in Italy and elsewhere. So I'm working mainly on the translation of this protest song in Italy and in the UK, translation from Spanish. And then, of course, my interest with Italian Canadian queer writing is always there. So I would like to, for example, I'm very interested in the work of Liana Kuzmanov, as you know, Licia. So maybe, I don't know, creative spaces, Liana Kuzmanov work. This certainly would be my future work interest. Yeah. All right.
If I can, I just put the queeritaliancanadian.com. That is the project, the sort of non-academic, because U of T and U of Sherbrooke are doing the academic research. And there you will find also under press all of the interviews and articles that have been done on the project. And next Friday at 2:30 Eastern Time, University of Sherbrooke is showing the film. So if you're interested, there's also a Facebook page called Creative Spaces, and the link will be there if anyone is interested.
Thank you all again so much. It's been such an interesting discussion. So I want to just make sure that I also acknowledge before we sign out the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies and everybody at the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies at York University. Thank you so much for your support, and it wouldn't have happened without them. So thank you so much.